Welcome to Roil Road, where we ask the question, what road are we all on and how do we navigate it? Today, Brian Martinez and I will be discussing universities, including statistics showing that they've lost the trust of a large segment of the American population. We will discuss the decision by famous psychology professor Jordan Peterson to leave academia in protest of what he describes as the sacrifice of rigorous academic standards in order to promote diversity, inclusion, and equity. Finally, we will discuss the long-term, large, and growing gender gap, with men increasingly not receiving higher education. But first, let me tell you about Roil. Roil is a better way to enjoy content online. You just tell Roil which internet content you like, such as YouTube channels, podcasts, and more, and then you can access them all in one place, the Roil app. It also uses content interconnection to break free from tech monopolies. Click the links below to learn more. Roil is just getting started, but it's going to be big. Be among the first to discover Roil. Now, let's get this show on the road. Okay, hello, Brian Martinez. So good to see you again.
Hey, it's good to see you too, John. How are you?
I'm well. I hope you've been having a good week. We have a interesting lineup of stories to talk about today. We'll be talking about Jordan Peterson and his resignation from the University of Toronto and the moves that he's making now with his career, what he's going to be doing next, as well as the state of play of higher education. And he had published a letter explaining his thinking, and we're going to be going over that. But first, why don't we set the stage with a discussion of public attitudes towards higher education, how that's been changing over time. So the research that I'm going to be going through here is from Pew, and it is a 2019 report on the partisan divide in attitudes towards higher education today. And this graph is the main story to tell. Between 2012 and 2019, the Democrats' attitudes towards higher education in terms of approval, disapproval, remained basically flat. Okay, they started at 67% in 2012 and went up slightly and then down, but it's not any real movement. It stayed at 67% in 2019. So basically flat. Whereas the Republican attitudes have gone through a major transformation between 2012 and 2019. And in particular, it was between 2015 and 2017, where you can see the, between 15 and 17, the approval among Republicans fell almost 20 points, from 54% to 36%, while the disapproval went up just about the exact same amount. So basically, between 2015 and 2017, about 20% of Republicans flipped from viewing higher education positively to viewing higher education negatively. Now, I would be fascinated to see some updated stats on this, because the cultural discussion surrounding these issues has really heated up or intensified or accelerated since 2019. But this is the most recent data that I was able to find, well distilled. Pew writes, a new Pew Research Center survey finds that only half of American adults think that colleges and universities are having a positive effect on the way things are going in the country these days. About 4 in 10, 38%, say they're having a negative impact, up from 26% in 2012. So overall, there is a very significant decrease in confidence in higher education, but that is driven by this really massive change that happened among Republicans. Pew goes on, the share of Americans saying colleges and universities have a negative effect has increased from 12 percentage points by 12 percentage points since 2012. The increase in negative views has come almost entirely from Republicans and independents who lean Republican. From 2015 to 2019, the share saying colleges have a negative effect on the country went from 37% to 59% among this group. Over that same period, the views of Democrats and independents who lean Democratic have remained largely stable and overwhelmingly positive. Two additional Pew Research Center surveys underscore the partisan gap in views about higher education. In late 2019, 84% of Democrats and independents who lean Democratic said that they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in college and university professors to act in the best interest of the public. Only 48% of Republicans and Republican leaners said the same. In fact, 19% of Republicans say they have no confidence at all in college professors to act in the public interest. And in early 2019, 87% of Democrats, but fewer than half, 44% of Republicans, said colleges and universities are open to a wide range of opinions and viewpoints. So we have really overwhelming support on the Democratic side, which I think is mirrored by the partisan ideological breakdown of professors and other staff at universities. That I think that it's well documented that they've become increasingly Democrat over time. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, that is largely true. I think it's also being not necessarily that the political views of the academics has changed much. I think it's largely been this way for the past, at least since, maybe the 1960s. It's, if anything, it's probably become more, let's say, hegemonic in that. I know that they use the words Democrat and Republican. I don't find that those are really as useful, but I understand what they're driving at. I think that it's the academics I think it's the last time I saw the statistics on it, 85% of people involved in education. So whether it's at the college level, the high school level, or even the elementary level, are left of center, and in many cases far left of center. And I think it's what we're looking at is really like it's our education system is leftist. And the reason why I'm making a distinction between that and Democrat is because I think that the political party of the Democrats and the Republicans is not really a good description of the values that people who vote that way tends to reflect, because there is a lot of, like some people who vote Democrat, they do that because, they think it's the closest thing to what they value, but they don't really like, the neolibs or the establishment Democrats or the war hawks in the Democrat Party, but maybe they like Bernie Sanders and AOC, or maybe they like, Gary Newsom or something, right? And so they side with or the squad more broadly. And so I guess it's a little bit of a nitpick, and I apologize for that, but I think the terminology Democrat Republican is kind of messy because, there is a lot of opinions on what that means, but I think that it just comes down to, whether you're on the left or the right, because those are more clear cut, easier to see, I guess you could say, in terms of what is valued here. So, and another thing about this too is that I think that the average American voter is unregistered in terms of like a party, and they just vote like, based on either what they've always voted for in the past or based on what they value. So, I have never known people who are, registered Democrats or registered Republicans, but I have known people who always vote one way or the other. And so because of that, you don't get like a full picture, because how else would Pew be able to determine what party a person is with unless they check what party they're registered with. And so I wonder if they're getting like the full scope. But
Mm-hmm.
With all that said, I don't disagree with the conclusions. I think all of it makes perfect sense.
Well, it's a challenge with survey data, right? So they need to figure out what is the question to ask. And so they could ask, well, do you lean left or lean right? But I think that a huge proportion of people would say, no, I'm not like that. I am in the center. I look at each issue. I decide each issue by its merits. I don't, apply some heuristic on a broad scale. And so if you're trying to do a survey, I think that you get cleaner results if you're asking them, look, are you a Republican or Democrat? Or if you're independent, do you identify as lean Democrat or lean Republican? Because those do have such concrete meanings. Even though, yes, I think you're losing a lot of nuance in the way people are thinking about it, but because they have concrete meanings, they're more suitable, I think, for these mass surveys. And
Sure.
so I think that a reaction that somebody typical of the university system might have to hearing this data, they would be something along the lines of, well, yeah, because smart people are in the universities and smart people are Democrats. They would say that it's this way because the Democrats are increasingly right, morally, spiritually, on the merits, following the science, you name it, just increasingly right. And the Republicans are increasingly wrong. And so, in a lot of contexts, you would expect an institution that is intended to appeal to the population as a whole, or huge swaths of the population. You'd expect an institution like that, higher education, to be concerned upon hearing, wait a minute, we've lost the confidence of 20% of the population, and it's not 20% of the population because not everybody falls into, because it's not really 50% are Republicans.
Yeah,
but anyway, this huge chunk, a huge, nothing to ignore chunk of the population, that an institution recognizing it's lost that confidence might second guess. I don't think that's the case here, because I don't think that it would occur to them that that there's anything valid to the critique, right? They might be, you might find justifications along the lines of, well, yes, we're making certain, privileged and unaware people uncomfortable, but that's part of our greater mission to accomplish all kinds of good things. Now, in terms of, are they convincing the public that this mission to produce good things is well guided? It seems like not so great. I mean, so here we have a 2018 Pew Research Survey took a deeper dive into the reasons for shifting views, and the survey first asked whether the higher education system in the U.S. is generally going in the right or wrong direction. This is like such a classic type of polling question. Is it right direction, wrong direction, right? They ask right or wrong direction on all kinds of different topics. And a majority of Americans, 61%, say it's going in the wrong direction. Republicans and Republican leaners are significantly more likely to express this view than Democrats and Democratic leaners, 73% versus 52%. But even the majority of Democrats and Democratic leaners think that it's going in the wrong direction. Now, I'm going to jump to some other interesting stuff that's in here that's not just to the point of partisan divide. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say do they tell you do you know if there was any discussion around why they felt like it was going in the wrong direction? Like, I would imagine, and it might be that, the case that everyone feels like it's going in the wrong direction for the same reasons. But I wonder if what Democrats might have thought the wrong direction means and what Republicans think the wrong direction means. I wonder if they both are on the same page there, because that could be a place where there's common ground, right?
Right, absolutely. For example, probably a lot of people think that it's going in the wrong direction for cost increase reasons, right? Nonpartisan, it's starting to cost too much, right? I think that's very likely a significant. Well, in fact, I know it's covered in here that is a significant part of the dissatisfaction. So this is an interesting thing that will be relevant to what Jordan Peterson talks about with his resignation. And this gets to the question of affirmative action and the admissions process. According to a WGBH News survey, the vast majority of Americans say it is important for colleges and universities to have a diverse student body in terms of race and ethnicity. about 6 in 10, 63%, say this is extremely or very important, and an additional 22% say it is somewhat important. Only 13% say diversity on campus is not important. Okay, so these are overwhelming numbers. Overwhelming numbers. We've got 63% extremely or very, 22% somewhat, 13% not at all. So, 87% to 13% say that it's important. However, and this is a real dichotomy of, well, what do people think when they're asked that question? Okay, so the question is it important for them to have a diverse student body? And it could be that people hear that question and think, what this question is really about is that the institutions are open and welcoming to everybody. And that's a different thing. You could have an institution that's open and welcoming to everybody, but but that may not result in a great deal of diversity because there just might not be diversity from the selection criteria. Okay, so that's a possibility. And the reason I bring that up is that this 87% overwhelming result, it contradicts what they talk about in the next paragraph, which is, however, a recent Pew Research Center survey finds that the public is not in favor of colleges and universities considering race or ethnicity in making admission decisions. And again, this is going to be overwhelming numbers. Some 73% of all adults say race or ethnicity should not be a factor in college admission decisions. About 1 in 5, 19% say this should be a minor factor, and 7% say it should be a major factor. Majorities across racial groups, 62% of blacks, 65% of Hispanics, 58% of Asians, and 78% of whites, say race and ethnicity should not be a factor in admission decisions. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to say race and ethnicity shouldn't be a factor in admissions decisions, but majorities of both groups express this view, 85% among Republicans and 63% of Democrats. So again, it's not 87-13, but 73-27 is again an overwhelming majority. And so there's some kind of disconnect there, it seems like, that they think that diversity is important to have in place, but they don't want to see diversity really considered in the admissions process. Does that strike you the way it strikes me?
No, because I think that there's maybe other things happening that are not immediately apparent. So when you ask the question, do you think diversity, what's the exact wording of the diversity question? Not the first question that everyone agreed with. Diversity is important. What's
I know that's a great question. I don't know. So this doesn't have that kind of deep dive. So the way that it's described is that for the value of the college and university to have a diverse student body in terms of race and ethnicity. So that's the phrase, right. Have a diverse student body in terms of race and ethnicity is how it's described here, but I don't have the exact question.
Right. Yeah, so it's hard to know, but let's just presume that it's that. It's still possible that people's answers could be influenced, answers to that question could be influenced by the notion that when people hear, are you for or against diversity, which is like a lot of times how these questions can appear to be framed, even if that's not how they're framed, then what the person hearing that might also be hearing, are you or are you not a racist? And so, of course, most people don't want to be perceived that way. And they say, no, diversity is fine. I don't have a problem with diversity at all. Right. And it's mainly because they're trying to, communicate that like they have a kind of, well, I'm going to just call it a liberal stance, because I think most of us do, on race, diversity, and ethnicity as it pertains to, things like education, searching for jobs, whatever, where people just want to be colorblind and they're just like, I'm okay with whatever, provided that they qualify for the position. And maybe when they hear this question about race and ethnicity, they're thinking, well, I don't want to exclude anyone based on that criteria, so I'm just going to say that I'm for diversity. So it could be that there's some, I noticed that people, when asked questions related to things that could put them in a position that they find is awkward for them. They will tend to try to sound as though they are, really open-minded, which they probably are, because I think that most of us are. And this is contradicted, or it appears to be contradicted by them saying, yeah, but even though I'm for diversity, of course, because again, it's in a lot of political discussion, being against diversity is being racist. And people don't want to be perceived that way. So they alter their answers, which I think is the reason why it comes across as a bit contradictory, because they might on the one hand say, well, if it's diverse, it's diverse. Plus, what does diverse mean? This is another thing you have to ask, because for some people, diverse means no white people. And for some people, diverse means a naturally occurring mix of different people who just happen to look different, who just happen to have different origins. And there's no right or wrong way to gauge whether or not something is diverse enough, because maybe you'll get more Nigerians than you will, South Koreans in one group or whatever, but they're by and large okay with that. And then for some people, diversity is like equal parts everything. We need this many of this many of this. And I think that depending on how those people interpret those words and what they mean, they're going to give a different answer. And I think that maybe it clouds things a little bit, but I mean, by and large, I don't think it's that inconsistent. And so when you look at the other statistic where they're like, well, I don't want, or I'm not really for taking into consideration people's race or ethnicity. Well, for some, it falls in line, right? Because if diversity means no white people or fewer white people or as few as possible, which is not an uncommon sentiment, I hate to say, it's true. They might say then, well, I'm not for people, judging based on race because, or making that a factor, because that would mean that white people would take advantage of that and use it against me. Or, do you see what I'm saying? So there is I think that the fairest way to look at it, so I'm getting a little, because these are probably fringe examples. So I think the fairest way to look at how this could work is you have people that generally believe that if diversity is naturally forming as a product of just people trying, and it just so happens that it shakes out and you get like a mix of people and no one is kept out based on their race. Because like right now, there's been a lot of lawsuits that Asians have, started against universities because universities are excluding them because the universities are saying, well, there's too many Asians. Right. So you don't even have to make it about white people. And so they're basically saying, well, we're not getting in on our merit. And this is the problem. And I think that most people, and I don't know if they did a study on this, but if you made merit the most important factor instead of race or ethnicity or diversity, as though those are in any way a noble thing to pursue, which I don't think they are, then you would probably get a far more consistent across the board sentiment. I think that most people would probably say, yeah, if they're good enough, they should do it. And it shouldn't have anything to do with color. So anyway, I don't want to drag this out too long. My final thoughts is I don't think it's that inconsistent depending on what they think of when they hear the word diversity and, whether or not it's important, because they could also be thinking about diversity of ideas, diversity of views, not just skin color, even though it is about skin color. But people do tend to switch their brains, right? Because they want to.
I think that I would resolve this inconsistency sort of in the same way that you are, in that it sounds like what they're saying is that it is that these overwhelming majority of people that say that race and ethnic diversity is extremely, very, or somewhat important, that mostly what they're thinking there is that nobody's race or ethnicity should be an obstacle or should lead them to feel like this place is not for me. and that it is important that the universities avoid any kind of tone like that would be like chilling the involvement of anyone on account of their racial group. But then when it comes to what do we value what are we willing to do? Or that's not really the right way to put it. How does fairness play into the picture? And I think that we have two different models of fairness that are sort of being advanced politically. And this may be too much of a digression, but we have two different models of fairness. One is fairness, demonstrable fairness in the situation, right? You have two people and they've got the same grades, but one has a higher SAT score. Or we have two people by objective standards. One person is doing better. Demonstrable fairness is that the person who has the better objective criteria, that is the person that should be chosen. And then there is like cosmic or like all things considered fairness, where you would say, all right, we need to think about not just how these applicants are stacking up on their application, but we need to think about what we project happened to their ancestors and what other people, like people that have some commonality to them, may have experienced through history. And what we've done there is we've
also what their placement in this position could do for other people who look like them, because if they don't see them, then they may not believe they can be them. Right?
Indeed. And so what we're doing is we're taking a relatively simple problem, which is who is the most qualified between these two candidates, and we are replacing it with an intractably complicated problem, right? That is, in the overall scheme of all that's good and bad and the consequences and the causes, which choice are we better off with? And a concern that creates for me is that I think that if I was going to create a list of the most important characteristics of leadership or leadership of an institution, right at the top of that list would be demonstrable fairness. That the people in the institution want to understand that the institution is fair, that they can see that it's fair, and once you start deviating from that, people have a lot less buy-in to the institution. And I think that the contrary view would be to say, well, look, situational fairness really doesn't cut it in that, because the world is just so unfair, right? There's so much arbitrariness about what circumstance people are born, what chances, opportunities they have in their lives. There's so much arbitrariness that what is the harm in inserting some arbitrariness into, say, the application process, right? Because once we start going down the road of not just looking at the individual applicants' demonstrated merits, once we start going down that road, we are going to be inserting arbitrariness, but you could say, well, there's so much arbitrariness that in the great sweep of how arbitrary things are overall, we're not adding to the arbitrariness that much, and maybe it's worth adding this amount of arbitrariness to it. But I'm quite skeptical of that view on the basis that, as I said, running an institution well, demonstrating fairness, having demonstrable fairness, a system that people can see and understand that it is clearly fair according to its terms. That's important. And the insertion of arbitrariness has a more corrosive effect in people's confidence and willingness to participate and willing to really try their hardest than people might give it credit for, or than people might appreciate. I think I have one more thing that caught my attention from this Pew, and that is is college worth it? Do people still think that it is beneficial to go to college? And according to Pew, large majorities say that it college is useful in opening doors to job opportunities. So 53% say it's very useful. 29% say it's somewhat useful. So again, overwhelmingly more than 80% of people say that college is useful in opening doors to job opportunities. Now, that is a question of employers' selection criteria. It gets different when we're asked about, is the college graduate actually going to be that much more prepared to excel on the basis of having gone to college? They write, the public remains skeptical that today's colleges are preparing people for the workforce. Only 16% say a 4-year degree from a college or university prepares someone very well for a well-paying job in today's economy, while 51% say it prepares them somewhat well. Community colleges get even less positive marks. Okay, now here's where I want to pause. Okay, so they're saying that 51% of people are saying that it prepares them somewhat well, and 16% say very well. So, okay, they are saying that there's a clear preparatory aspect. I guess Pew was hoping that it would be higher, that Pew's characterizing this as skeptical, but it's not that skeptical. And then they go on to say the community college does even less well. And there, I think that their take on the data is flipped around. Community college, and I'm about to read it to you, does slightly worse. Okay. Slightly worse. It's not a significant step down. So we've got 16% say very helpful for a 4-year degree. 12% say very helpful for a 2-year degree. And again, when we go to somewhat helpful, 51% say somewhat helpful for a 4-year degree. 46% say somewhat helpful for a 2-year degree. So the perception is that community college is almost as good. It's just like slightly less, even though it is 2 years instead of 4 years and a much lesser financial investment. And so this sort of leads towards the idea that there's a desire to see some kind of post-secondary effort. And it's almost like a box to be checked, right? Mm-hmm. That, okay, this person went to some kind of school, got some kind of paper, all right, move them along. I was just interested to see that the gap is not that large. And then I think
I was going to say, I'm not that surprised. I think that we have become pretty cynical on education in general. There's a lot that I could go into, but what I have noticed working as someone, I work in education, but I also know and have, some relationships, professional in some cases, with educators, is that education has changed. Like overall, the quality has gone down, and I think it starts with public schools, which we can, we don't have to get in too deep on. But what I've noticed is that when I was a young man and I was going to school, there was a certain level that was expected that you would operate at when it came to, your academic ability by the time you got out of high school. And so back then, college wasn't seen as, let's say, a prerequisite to having like a decent job. It was considered extra. I'm talking about the 80s here, so it's kind of a long time ago. So if you wanted to go into college, you would do that if you wanted to do something that required additional and specialized training, like if you wanted to go into nursing, or if you want to go into medicine, or if you wanted to go into law, or if you wanted to go into STEM, you wanted to be an engineer or a scientist or something like that, right? You would go to a university or a college, and you would learn these additional skills. And it was presumed that when it came to things like your reading comprehension, your mathematical ability, and all the other basic things, that you had those basically like crossed off, not a problem. I mean, unless you're going to get into crazy math like, calculus or something like that. And what's happened is the quality of public education was so bad that colleges had to compensate because they would not give students, especially like maybe I'm, this is a little bit anecdotal, but I, grew up in the inner city of Chicago. I went to school there and I was lucky enough to get into a gifted program. But and that was in elementary, but after I went to high school, I noticed that everyone in the high school was learning at a much lower level than I already learned when I was in 6th grade or 7th grade. And it put me in a position where I was able to ace everything and it's not because I don't even think that I'm particularly intelligent. I just want to, this isn't a boast, right? I'm saying that the other students, my classmates, were not sufficiently prepared, and they see a problem with an X in it, and they would say, what is this? Like, I can't even conceive of this. And I'm like, oh, it's just algebra. Right?
It is funny to see the people who have the mental block where they're like, numbers and letters in math? No.
Yeah, right. You can't do that. Right. So like, but that did happen. And then what would happen additionally was I saw it in high school, where high school math teachers had to throw out their syllabi and basically go back to basics because they wanted to prepare their students. And so they were like, well, if we get to trigonometry by the time they graduate, I'm going to consider that a victory, even though I was learning trigonometry in 8th grade. And so it was a really strange setup. And then when I later went to university, or I went to college, not university, I had to wait a while because I was working. And then like in the 90s, I went to college. And when I was in college, we were taking math and history and reading courses. And I could not believe the level people were operating at. Again, they had to learn algebra again. And I think that it's just that, like, if there's failures early on in like the lower grades, let's say the teachers they're not getting fired. There isn't a consistent curriculum. They're unable to do the job. And I think that there are other like sort of social cultural factors, like single motherhood and the amount of attention that's being given to kids, especially, like I said, low income inner city children, which is where I grew up. It's what I know. That it's basically like the responsibility of teaching at these lower levels gets pushed up into university levels. And when I was in, college, I noticed that the math classes, as an example, because it's probably one of the better examples, they were still learning at a early high school level. And so I think that I couldn't be the only person that's observing this. And so what I think the lack in confidence is coming from, and this is it comes across a bit of a scam too, because if you think about it, if you're still learning something in college that you were supposed to learn in elementary school, you're not only are you way behind on how much you should be learning, but you're also paying out the behind for it. Now you have like an $80,000, student loan debt, and you finally figured out what algebra is. And it doesn't really seem all that, it doesn't seem that practical. So the problem of education, I think, starts much earlier. But in addition to that, it is disproportionately expensive. And even considering the quality of education you're getting, even community colleges are not really, appropriately preparing people. And I always tell people on my other show, if you don't know what you want to do, and especially if you're male, but not exclusively, and you think that university or college is the answer, which is what kids are told. They say, well, you got to go to college now. Whereas before it was like, if you got a high school diploma, you could get like, a decent job, even a white collar job. And support a family and go right into the middle class, right? If you just stick to it, you wouldn't need a degree. But now everyone is saying you have to have a degree, and it has to be a 4-year degree, and then you can get a job at like a Starbucks. And so like that, it's not working out because it's costing people more than what, and again, they don't even, like, they haven't figured out what they want to do yet. And so this is the reason why they pick their major or they pick their classes based on their interest. Oh, look, I'll do film studies. We'll just talk about movies, or I'll just take this gender studies course, or I'll take this sociology thing, and I'm sure I'll get a job. And then they don't. And what often ends up happening is they end up getting jobs in education. So they go back into the system that they probably resent, and, they continue the cycle, right? So like, the issue of education that I think a lot of people are trying to like pinpoint is that it does not appear to be preparing young people for the world. And it's likely due to a number of things, not least of which is everything I've already said. In addition to that, though, there is, I think the majors and classes and courses do not prepare people for real work, real jobs. A lot of times they give them useless degrees, and then they cost a lot of money. You also, I think, have a problem with they're not like treating the best teachers and professors well enough to that could probably prepare kids for the future. I think that the curriculum should change to adapt, because I think it's still working on old models, that don't take into account how much technology has changed and how much job prospects have changed. There's another thing too. When I was in high school in the ghettos of Chicago, which is where I lived, after I got out of the grammar school gifted program, we were learning computers on machines that I had never seen before because they were from the 1960s. And so, and people were, I was learning, do you remember that written language that secretaries used to use? It's called shorthand. Mm-hmm. I was learning shorthand. Nobody used that. Why was I learning shorthand? And yet we were. And it was like really outdated, classes and really outdated learning that wasn't useful. And I think that that's another problem. And then you add on top of that all of the kind of politicization of our learning environments, of our universities and colleges. And it's no wonder that people are extremely cynical about whether or not it's useful. And plus, a lot of kids are cynical, and they have every right to be, because, they're not like what I was going to say before.
Hang on.
Yeah.
No, they aren't that cynical. Hang on.
Well, I mean, like, not unrealistically so.
Because, look, among Democrats, it's almost flat, right? It's maintained a very positive assessment from Democrats. But among Republicans, yes, people have become very cynical. Education, it's a really challenging problem, right? Because obviously there are a lot of things that could use to be changed. There's so many things, in fact, that could be used to be changed that it's not practical to have a system where we go, okay, well, let's go through this checklist and change all these things. It's like we need to set up a new incentive structure. We need to set up new expectations about how things are going to work. The idea of learning is at the university because that's where the knowledge is. No, the knowledge is now everywhere. It's on the internet. And the access to knowledge in your pocket and your phone beats the pants off of the access to knowledge that was in the university library in the 90s. And the costs have continued to go up and up. And something's going to change. This is going to be one of those examples where there's an old saying that people overestimate how much things are going to change in 2 years, but underestimate how much it's going to change in 10 years. And if we're in a situation where online learning is growing at, I'll call it this, I'm pulling this out of the air, say 10% a year. Okay. After 2 years, that hasn't changed that much. After 10 years, it's transformed the entire landscape. And for all of the discussion of ideology on campus and blah, 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 that is probably a lesser variable than access online. I'll just say very briefly. So I went to college at a big state school. I went to law school at an elite law school. And then about 15 years later, I did an online master's in computer science at a good school. And I will tell you, the online degree was head and shoulders above. I could do a whole episode talking about it. It was the best educational experience I've ever had. This was the Georgia Tech Online Masters in Computer Science. And I mean, I see the light. Online learning, yeah. We are going to figure this out, and it is going to transform the way that people get educated.
Oh yeah, I think it's inevitable.
So now Jordan Peterson. Okay, so the second story, I want to talk about Jordan Peterson's resignation from University of Toronto. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit about this, talking about who Jordan Peterson is in case people aren't familiar, although I expect that people probably do have a sense at least who he is. So Jordan Peterson, to me, is a really interesting guy. He exploded onto the scene in, I think, 2017. And to his supporters, he delivered a message that, to do my best to condense it, was try hard in your life and decide that it will be worth it. Now, people have criticized that, saying, oh, that's just some trite self-help stuff that's been around forever. And of course, yes, that's true. The idea, try hard, believe it's worth it, that's been around forever. But it's a very difficult message to communicate to people in a way that makes them feel it in their bones. And that's what made Peterson special. On the other hand, there's a Kanye West lyric that goes, name one genius that ain't crazy. Mm-hmm. Well, Peterson left the public stage for a few years, and he's described the cause of this is that he had an extended period of illness as a result of stopping taking benzodiazepines. So that's things like Xanax to try and calm your nerves in an anxious moment. Now, I'm not saying that that's what makes him crazy. The craziness is, I've described some other things. That's a medical condition. I wouldn't want to cast any aspersions or shame on that.
Yeah.
But now Peterson has recovered enough that he's back on the scene, and he just recently went on the Rogan Podcast. That's something that's received a lot of attention in the last week. And I was interested to see that because years ago they had an episode together that I thought was really fascinating. So they did the episode. It's over 4 hours long. I only watched part of it, and it's gotten some criticism. And I'm just going to quickly give my take on the episode. I was concerned for him watching it. He seemed a bit manic. He didn't conclude his thoughts before jumping the rails to the next one. He would be very emphatic about one thing, and then a moment later emphatic about something totally different. Okay, and it felt off. And now I'm not ready to bury a guy because he wasn't firing on all cylinders during a podcast episode. And I'm glad he's off the benzos. And it just makes me think back to him in 2017. He would drive himself so hard, appearing anywhere, talk to anyone, and he gave some really masterful performances. But he was developing a benzo addiction at the time. And it just strikes me as he flew too close to the sun. And I hope that he is now learning how to slow down and pace himself. Now, he also recently has decided that he has announced that he's going on tour, again, which he had done in that earlier period. And his tours are, he goes and appears on different shows, but he also books theaters and appears before live audiences where he delivers lectures. And so in order to free himself to be able to do that, I think that at least that's part of his motivation. He has resigned from his full professor position in psychology at the University of Toronto. And concurrent with his resignation, he published a letter sort of explaining his thinking. And the subhead of his letter really summarizes it. He says, the appalling ideology of diversity, inclusion, and equity is demolishing education and business. Okay, and that he's going to go on to sort of substantiate that and give some more texture to it. So, his concern here, and this is relating back to what the Pew Research is talking about, okay, that Pew Research, I'm just referring back to this, says that although the vast majority of people want a diverse student body, also the vast majority of people do not want race or ethnicity to be the selection criteria. And Peterson is saying that what is happening in the schools is that race and ethnicity are being the selection criteria, and that is, in his view, damaging the institution. So he writes, there's simply not enough qualified BIPOC, so that's Black, Indigenous, people of color. Yeah. There's simply not enough qualified BIPOC people in the pipeline to meet diversity targets quickly enough. This has been common knowledge among anyone remotely truthful, among any remotely truthful academic who has served on hiring committees for at least the last 3 decades. So he's saying that, look, hiring committees have been seeking to make the institutions more diverse, but they have been not wanting to do it at the cost of merit as they see it. And that's why things haven't gotten as diverse as expected. Now, it would be easy to think, so giving the easy Democratic argument or easy liberal argument or easy leftist argument, to imagine that, well, there's all these qualified people that meet all of the diversity stuff that we want. It's just that the reason that they haven't been hired is that the hiring committees have been racist, right? That would be if that is the state of affairs, okay, that is an easy fix. We need to resolve the racism of the hiring committees. Peterson is saying that that is not the truth, that the truth is that the hiring committees have been trying to bring in diverse candidates, but the qualified ones are not numerous enough. Okay, and so he's now saying that the tendency in the universities is to change or lessen their measuring criteria in order to force through the meeting of diversity targets. Other ways that he's talking about this necessity driving the university in ways that are not appropriate. He writes, all of my craven colleagues must draft diversity, inclusion, equity statements to obtain a research grant. So he's saying that the grant issuing, the way it works in academia, is that in order to do research, you need to get some funding to do it. You write a grant application, and the grant applications are now insisting that you write a statement that is basically pledging your allegiance to this notion of needing to drive towards diversity, and it can be a non sequitur, right? You're trying to do research on radio astronomy or something like that, and then all of a sudden you need to be dropping in a diversity, inclusion, equity statement, and that concerns him. So he continues to write, they, his colleagues, all lie, excepting the minority of true believers, and they teach their students to do the same. They do it constantly with various rationalizations and justifications, further corrupting what is already a stunningly corrupt enterprise. Some of my colleagues even allow themselves to undergo so-called anti-bias training conducted by supremely unqualified human resource personnel, lecturing inanely and blithely and in an accusatory manner about theoretical, all-pervasive racist, sexist, heterosexist attitudes. Such training is often a precondition to occupy a faculty position on a hiring committee. Now, this is something that to give it its most favorable light, I think people would say, well, what's the harm, right? What's the harm in you're going to be on a hiring committee? Let's have somebody come and talk to you about things that might open your mind on the diversity question. So I think that people would defend it either by saying, look, it is potentially helpful, and if not helpful, not too harmful. I think would be the argument. Peterson then goes on to summarize some of the research surrounding, well, is this training that is involving the concept that, well, you need to be awoken to your implicit biases, is that training scientifically grounded? And he makes the case that no, it is not. He goes on to talk about that the diversity, inclusion, and equity is how he phrases it, movement is leading to the eradication of objective testing, such as GRE for graduate school admissions, which will have a deleterious effect on the ability of students so selected to master such topics as the statistics that all social sciences and medicine, for that matter, rely on completely for their validity. It is sort of astonishing to me, the idea that colleges are ceasing their reliance on standardized tests like the SAT, ACT for undergrad and the GRE for graduate school. That is really surprising to me. I wonder how truly widespread that is, because those tests just seem like a good idea to me.
That does seem. I had the same thought. I was like, well, I mean, if there's no way to, like, if we're willing to essentially, and this goes back to what I was saying before about, like, you can't hold students back anymore, for example, because you are your success as an instructor is measured by how many of your students pass your class. So you let them all pass, right? And I think that it's the quality of the education itself suffers from it because the standards are thrown out. I hope that this is an isolated case because I haven't looked into it, like to see if this is common. But the worst thing is that it doesn't really shock me that they're doing this. Because like the to meet the quotas seems to, be a higher priority than giving whoever is there the best quality education. And the only way to do that is to figure out what they already know so that you have like a place to launch from.
See, to me, the standardized test is so core to the notion of demonstrated fairness and to the key value proposition of the university, which is this is where smart people are and where people get smarter, right? That is the value proposition of the university. And the history of the standardized tests is that it didn't used to be standardized tests. They came around in the mid-20th century. Before then, it was basically discriminatory. It was, who do you know? Did your parents go to this school? Are you from a good family? And that's a disaster. It is so much better that system was supplanted with a standardized test that, and again, demonstrated fairness. Everybody thinking about going to college took coming out of high school. And it was hard. And people took it and they had to sit there. It was hours long. They sweated through it and they walked away and they were like, dang, you had to be really smart to ace that thing. Right. And that gave the whole enterprise a feeling of legitimacy based on, look, there's a demonstrated fair standard here. And so that's something that people feel confident in buying into. But once you get rid of that, it's just so central to the value proposition. It seems like if you're willing to get rid of that, what aren't you willing to get rid of?
Right. Yeah. It's definitely anti-meritocratic. But again, I don't know. I mean, I think going back to like, why were people in favor of the idea that diversity is good? And I think that what most people think is, well, if it happens naturally as a product of the meritocratic system we have in place, then I don't have a problem with it. And I think that's what is the problem in this particular case, because the people involved with this seem to be under this belief that all human beings, regardless of their ethnicity, their race, their upbringing, all of them are the same, and all of them have the same potential and the same interest and the same levels of merit, that the fact that we put in any sort of like system that, divides or not divides, that determines who the most qualified candidates is, well, that is, potentially seen as an oppressive system against those that wouldn't be able to meet that standard. And so it has to go because it gets in the way of our vision that everyone is the same. And that, you know, if someone happens to be smarter, it's not because, you know, the way they were brought up or because of other factors, cultural factors, even potentially genetic factors. I know that that's taboo to say, but I think it does factor in to some level. Well, I mean, that's not allowed. You can't have that view. So if it just so happens that the smartest people with the highest IQs and the best learning potential in the United States are either people from the Far East or from, you know, or they're Ashkenazi Jews, well, that's just because of bigotry. And of course, it doesn't really make any sense, but I do think it's a popular position. So I think that is likely what informs, and it really comes back to what I was saying before. It's about this idea that we are all the same, and we just have to like dismantle any systemic institutions that exist that are keeping the most needy of us, or those who are lagging behind the most. Well, they're obviously obstructed by this, and that's why it needs to change. Instead of simply saying, well, you know, there are a number of factors, most of which cultural, probably environmental or social, that we could be looking at and having honest discussions about. But even then, the best you can really do is remove obstacles. Obstacles for, you know, the people who are, for everyone primarily, like that will sort of make these strange judgments, because the people who are getting kind of screwed over the most right now are the people who have the best outcomes, specifically Asians, I think.
Well, I think that this notion of, you know, the best you can do is remove obstacles, that's a very interesting idea. I mean, we're in this situation where there is a disparity in development of communities. So some children are growing up in highly developed communities where they have lots of opportunities and lots of adult attention that are just investment that is just shepherding them through, and they've got a peer group that is good role models, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. That's people growing up in a highly developed community. And then we have other communities where it's not the case. They have father absence very often. They just don't have the resources in their community to dedicate as much to helping the children flower, right? And that's a tragic thing. And the problem is that how you cause a community to develop is an unsolved problem. Okay? It's not like that we have a simple playbook, and if we just apply some recipe that we can predictably reverse the types of community dynamics that I just talked about. And this is true in both foreign development efforts and domestic development efforts. And the history of that is, it's challenging. I'm not saying that we should give up on it. I think that we should do continued investment and just have some faith that in the fullness of time things will develop. But there tends to be a attitude by some on the left that, oh, this is just lickety split. All we have to do is just do the things that make them develop. And the only reason that we're not doing that is that we don't have the empathy for them, or our priorities are wrong, et cetera. And I think that isn't really coming to terms with the difficulties in outside forces moving in to develop something that have been demonstrated, that it just doesn't succeed the way that we might expect that it would. And one thing that is really interesting in that regard is the notion of central planning versus individual decision making. And by individual decision making, I mean basically capitalism. That if you have a system developed that creates an opportunity for people to identify, okay, what is the most value-added thing I could do now to myself and my community. They, from having the situational knowledge of exactly where they're at, are going to be better suited than some kind of outside planner being like, well, you and your community need this. And this is a good segue to the last thing I'm going to go through in the Peterson letter, which is this interesting extended quote from Vladimir Putin, where Vladimir Putin is talking about the current American trends towards DIE or social justice, or however you want to encapsulate it. And it's interesting from a couple regards. I mean, one is that there's a tendency to be like in denial that this is actually happening, that this is a real trend. And it is so much happening that it is blatantly apparent to Vladimir Putin, all the way in Russia, and to the point where he makes an extended statement and speech about it. And two, we're talking about the dichotomy between the central planning attitude towards development versus the individual decision-making capitalistic attitude towards development. The Russian experience speaks very much to that, right? Because they had this idea of, we are going to bring this cosmic justice. We are going to not have the focus on demonstrable fairness of the individual situation. Instead, we're going to come up with a system that sort of solves it all. And that was disastrous for Russia. And even Putin in this speech is recognizing the great cost that attitude had, and this was the USSR's political system. So Putin speaks and says, the advocates of so-called social progress believe they are introducing humanity to some kind of new and better consciousness. Godspeed, hoist the flags, as we say, go right ahead. So Putin is basically saying, hey, we're hoping for the West to fail. Go. It's all you go, march off this cliff. And Putin continues to. The only thing I want to say now is that their prescriptions are not new at all. It may come as a surprise to some people, but Russia has already been there. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks, relying on dogmas of Marx and Engels, also said that they would change existing ways and customs, and not just political and economic ones, but the very notion of human morality and the foundations of a healthy society. The destruction of age-old values, religion, and relations between people, up to and including the total rejection of the family, we had that too. Encouragement to inform on loved ones. All this was proclaimed progress, and, by the way, was widely supported around the world back then, and was quite fashionable, same as today. By the way, the Bolsheviks were also absolutely intolerant of opinions other than theirs. This, I believe, should call to mind some of what we are witnessing now. Looking at what is happening in a number of Western countries, we are amazed to see the domestic practices which we, the Russians, fortunately have left, I hope, in the distant past. The fight for equality and against discrimination has turned into aggressive dogmatism bordering on absurdity, when the works of great authors of the past, such as Shakespeare, are no longer taught at schools or universities because their ideas are believed to be backwards. The classics are declared backwards and ignorant of the importance of gender or race. In Hollywood, memos are distributed about proper storytelling and how many characters of what color or gender should be in a movie. This is even worse than the agitprop department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Golly, I wouldn't have expected Putin to say that. Now,
he probably said it because he doesn't think that, first of all, there could be a bit of a let's say a mind game going on, because I think that a lot of people don't believe anything that Putin says. And so a lot of Americans, right? And so if he says it, even if he's telling them the truth, they're not going to listen because there's a bit of a reverse psychology thing happening. But I also think that he probably thinks, well, this is the mess that they're in. I don't think they can correct the ship because there are still generations of young people being educated in this mindset, right? And it's not like they go to a class called, cultural Marxism. It's like they go to any class, and then the sort of model of class warfare is injected into the actual teaching because the instructors believe it. And so they just pass that on. And then these kids take it on. And I think Putin is like, well, they can't stop it now. So if I told them to their face this was happening, even though it probably doesn't have a lot to do with him anymore. I know he used to work for the KGB or whatever, but there's nothing we can do. So it's sort of a bit of a taunt, you could say. And I think that Putin, I could be wrong here, but I think that Putin did learn from the fall of the Soviet Union that as a political model, it won't work. And I think he's trying something different. I mean, obviously, it's dictatorial and authoritarian, if not totalitarian. But it's not I don't think it's communist. I think he's working with a different model of total control.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I mean, before reading this, I didn't realize that Putin was so harsh towards communism, right?
Yeah.
Because he is sort of Russian expansionist, and that's how the USSR was. I had thought maybe he was more sympathetic to the old system, but he clearly sees that the communist system in the Soviet Union was a failure. That does seem to be his attitude.
Yeah.
Now,
I think he might be more of and I know it's going to sound weird, but since the state is still the state in Russia is still the most powerful body, and since the state still does a lot of oversight of people's individual action, individual choices. It's not like a free market, right? Because the Russian government has a tremendous amount of oversight. It's not the USSR, but it's still kind of, I don't know if it's socialist, but there is a lot of government centralized power in Russia. And it's obviously more nationalist than the USSR was, which was more internationalist, right? I always have this saying where I try to explain people the ways that the Nazis and the communists of World War II were the same and how they were different. And it was the way that I say that they were the same is that they were both totalitarian ultimately, and they were both global powers. The difference was the Soviets wanted the whole world to be communist, and that would make them basically the same entity, but only along the lines of their ideology. And the Nazis wanted the whole world to be Germany. So they wanted the same things, but they just saw it in slightly different ways, right? And so Russia, modern Russia is trying to figure out, how do I still control everyone in the population and not make it a communist country, because that is, has a potential for total collapse again. And so still not good. I don't like either of them, but that's kind of where they are.
So the last story that I have on the state of play in American higher education deals with the gender gap, that there are just far fewer boys, far fewer young men going to college. And this is from the Daily Wire. And the impetus for this is that Andrew Yang, the former Democratic presidential candidate, has taken up this cause to some degree. He went to Twitter, and this is a bold move for him. I mean, for a Democrat to do this, that could bury him in that.
He's no longer a Democrat.
Ah, okay.
I heard that I heard that he came out and said that he's an independent now. So I think that he's no longer a Democrat. I saw John Stossel did an interview with Andrew Yang on that.
So he posts to Twitter, men now comprise only 40.5% of college students and are failing in high school at much higher rates. There's a crisis among American boys and men that is too often ignored and is definitely going unaddressed. Well, bravo for him. That is a brave thing for somebody in his position to say. Going into some of the statistics on this, so this is quoting a Brookings Institute set of statistics, and people can Google Brookings Institute. It is a generally left-leaning think tank. It's one of the most prestigious think tanks in the country. And so this is a case where you have the left, Brookings, and Daily Wire on the right agreeing on the numbers. So when you have the left and right agreeing on the data, then probably this is true. So they write, according to Brookings Institute, college enrollment has been declining in recent years, but the decrease was seen most intensely among male students. Overall, first-time enrollment for the fall of 2020 was down 13% than the year prior, but the decrease in male enrollment was more than 7 times bigger than the decline in female enrollment. So among women, the enrollment went down 0.7%, okay, so less than 1%, and among men, it went down by a little bit over 5%. In fall 2020, only 41% of students who were enrolled in post-secondary education were men. Young men are also not as likely to graduate from high school and are less likely to graduate from college after enrollment. At every stage of education, women have been graduating at higher rates than men. This is true for high school, 2-year colleges, and 4-year colleges. This has also resulted in men getting fewer degrees than women. According to Brookings, in the 18-19 academic year, around 74 men got a bachelor's degree for every 100 women who received one. In the same time period, women received 61% of associate's degrees, 61% of master's degrees, and 54% of doctoral degrees. Now, one could argue, one would expect an argument along the lines of, look, this is a moment in time. Men have done so much better in the past. The fact that women are having a moment in the sun is nothing to be concerned about. That's appropriate. And so the thrust of that argument would be to justify the essentially complete lack of concern over this question. Okay, there is no men's issue that our society seems to show concern about, in my opinion. If you could identify one, I would be interested and surprised. These are pretty stark numbers, and it gets absolutely no interest or attention. And in fact, the opposite. If you listen to the positionality related to men and women in education, it's always the same story, which is men are the problem and women are the priority, right?
Yep.
And so here we have men are 40% of students, and they're still going to be described as the problem, and women are still going to be described as the priority. Okay, but back to the idea that this is a moment in time. And this is some really interesting data that they have. So, while women have had while more women have had a bachelor's degree or higher, starting with those who were born in 1955 up to those born in 2001, those who were born in 1954 or before were in a cohort where men held more degrees. So it's not really a moment in time. You would have to be born before 1955 to be in a cohort where men had more degrees. So that is over 65 years old. So for our lifetimes, there has been this tilt in favor of women in higher education. And indeed, this is further fascinating, the statistics have almost flipped themselves. So we are in the understanding that back in the days before feminism and liberation, etc., 1955 and before, that during those periods, it was a stark, oppressive situation where women were basically not allowed to get degrees. So the deck was just super stacked against them. So let's go to what the stats are. For those born before 1955, and therefore they're 65 years old and up in 1919, men were 9 percentage points more likely than women to hold at least a bachelor's degree. Okay, so the pre-1955 cohort differential was 9%. Out of those who were born from 1985 to 1954, and therefore were 25 to 34 years old in 2019, men were 8% points less likely to have attained that level of education than women are. So the disparity now of men receiving fewer degrees than women is roughly equivalent. 9% versus 8%. It's not a significant difference. Is roughly equivalent to the male favoring difference that was present in the pre-1955 cohort. I think that that's a really interesting way to highlight the severity of the problem, right? Because we're given to understand that the problem of women's education back then was a very severe and compelling and important problem that needed to be addressed. Interesting that now we're in a situation where it's flipped. It's of almost identical severity. And people don't care about men, basically.
No. And it's worse than that, too, because, okay, I think that because you can find many examples of women going to college even before that. So it was clear that they weren't really being gate-kept out of it, but that they either weren't interested or there wasn't really a need because we had a kind of, the way that we organized families was that men were expected to be breadwinners and women were expected to stay at home and raise children and take care of the roost, right? So one of the things that's really interesting about this is that the numbers have flipped, but the expectations are the same. So women, even college-educated women, and amongst college-educated women in the United States, the most educated class of women, or the woman who gets the most, women who tend to get the most degrees are Black women. So, this is like, they've really gone for the, let's help the little guy kind of thing. But the downside of this, and this is really important, is that women with college degrees are going to be looking for men with more earning potential than they have. And so they're not going to find them because what women look for in men and what men look for in women are not the same. So back when men were earning more degrees, okay, they were looking for women who had what kind of qualifications? Well, obviously they wanted women who were, they showed like genetic fitness, they were attractive, they looked like they could, have children, they weren't unhealthy, and, beyond that, they wanted a woman who was going to love them, love their children, take care of their homes, etc. So like their earning potential as women, their status as women, their ability to even like be tremendously productive or highly intelligent, those were not qualities men looked for. And I think to some degree, they still don't. But women have always looked for men that have high earning potential. They make good money. They're high status, right? And they're going to expect that. But the problem is that if men are getting, like they're not getting education at the same levels, they're not getting degrees, they're not realizing their potential in one way or another, women are not going to find them attractive. And ultimately, this is going to result for problems for women as well as men, because they're going to say, well, why can't I find a guy that's, making more money than me and she's doing some, pretty high paying job. She's not going to find a man that's going to meet her criteria. She's going to find herself waiting longer to have children, which could cause problems for children. This is just the science of that. And they're going to find that they're dissatisfied. And of course, the men will be too, unless, and there is like a silver lining here, unless the men that no longer seek college degrees are instead seeking a different kind of training. Maybe they're going into trades, which I think are very important. And I think they make very good money doing that. But I think that aside from that exception, I think that this is going to be a much bigger problem than when it was the reverse, because when it was the reverse, it just so happened that it worked out that men weren't looking for those qualities in women anyway, and women were looking for the qualities that those men had at that time. But because men and women are not simply interchangeable, you can't just make a man low status and a woman high status and expect the woman to be attracted to that man, because women, they just won't do that. I mean, like in most cases, they won't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I think that, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out over the next couple decades. Life is a hard problem. There's always going to be some kinds of compromises. There's no life course where you're like, look, I'm going to get everything that I want. And so, there will be situations where women, go down this path of job and career and leave family for too late, and they might be disappointed, but then again, they do have the job and career out of it, right? And so nobody lives a life where they're happy with how every pin fell, right?
Sure.
And people might end up living according to different arrangements than what they have in the past. I mean, the numbers certainly tell the story that marriage is probably going to be less a part of the future than it was part of the past. I mean, that's the data. It seems to be getting worse every year. Excuse me, I don't want to say worse. Less marriagey every year.
Yeah.
And we will, nothing is ever certain, right? We will just have to see how this plays out.
Yeah.
I
agree with that. I guess what I'm mostly pointing, because if that's where things just go organically, I don't really have an opinion on it either way. But where I think the problem is going to be is that while times they are a changing, the expectations of women have not. So what men are still going to be responsible for being the engine that drives society. They're expected to make sure the lights come on. When they flip the switch, the water is running, that everything is still running as planned. It's like the pigeons in the Matrix, right? We don't pay attention to them because they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And, but the problem is that if women are changing, their lifestyle, and it changes their priorities, and it changes what they're looking for, but they're asking men to stay in the same role, right? It's going to create problems because, without the people doing the trades, without the people who are running the backbone of our society, driving, the trucks for the supply lines, making sure that the toilets flush, making sure the lights are on, making sure all of these things are functioning, right? The garbage gets taken out, the sewer is working, whatever. Without those things, your white collar social media job is meaningless. Because you know what I'm saying? Like there are dependent systems, right? So women generally want comfy office jobs that are in marketing or are in real estate or they're in tech or whatever, and they get that, or they do human resources anywhere. Well, the issue is that if our society doesn't have the people that keep it running in the background, then those white collar positions that in the comfy offices are going to be the first to go. Because they need the other things to work, right? And so I guess we ignore men's issues at our own peril as a society in total, because you can't have your comfy office job if there's no one around anymore to keep the lights on and keep the water running. And if men don't feel like there's an incentive outside of survival to do those things, they're not going to do those things. So we're going to lose it all.
Yeah. I mean, We don't know.
We don't know for sure. I mean, I'm just saying it could be a problem. Like women have to, and I know that it feels like I'm picking on women here, but I think it's important. Like I think women have to like really try to understand how important men are to keeping our civilization going. They are like the central piece. And as long as that is the case, women have to take that into consideration.
See, okay, so now you keep using the construction that Alison Tiemann highlights as this is the construction that can never be used. Okay, and that is women have to, right? And so Alison Tiemann points out, look, you cannot finish the sentence, women have to, in any way without getting in trouble, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to be, in fact, the state of play. And women, in fact, do have this degree of social power where men, by and large, are trying to appeal to them and will do what it will acquiesce to them to make them happy. And that's how this train is being driven right now. And that forms a fascinating landscape. Is the perfect landscape? No, of course not. But one can't sit around waiting for the world to be perfect. The world's never going to be perfect. Not. The question is just how do we each individually learn to move in the environment that as it presents itself, and it is what it is.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, again, what I'm saying is not prescriptive. I believe that people should make their own individual choices, but I think that if you're taking a wider angle view of it, you might want to take these factors into consideration, because I mean, again, you don't have to care about this stuff. You could just live your life and do what you want to do, and hopefully it'll turn out as good as you can eke out. But yeah, I guess I'm looking at like a longer game, and I think that women might find that degree, career, and money is not everything. And that they may find that there's a hole that is missing. This is not going to be the case for everyone, and I also include men in this. But I think that we should take it into consideration.
I apologize if I'm coming off a little bit like insouciant or none of this is to diminish the value of what you do and what the Honey Badgers do in trying to raise awareness to this stuff. I mean that's still I don't want to be heard to sort of downplay the value of that.
No, I know it's okay, and I know that the reason why I bring it up because it's what I think about. But I guess if the only way this would change, to be honest, is if women altered their preferences, and I just don't see that happening. I couldn't even imagine, because I've had these arguments with people where they would say, "Oh, well, why do women only pick based on status and wealth and earning potential, etc., when it comes to men?" And I say, "Well, I don't know, but are you going to tell them that they can't do that?" You're not going, no one's going to do that, because one thing that we're never allowed to do is exactly what you said. Tell women what they should do. And so I'm not going to tell them what they should do, but I am going to say that if you just keep operating along that trajectory, you're going to find that it's going to be much more difficult to find a man that meets that criteria if you ever decide that you would like a partner. And I think that when we're in our 80s and, we're sickly, or we see that like the twilight of our life is approaching. Do you want to be alone when that happens? Because I don't think people do. And I think that that's like a fair thing to put forward to people to consider,
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. And I'm so looking forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, I love these conversations. Thank you so much for bringing me on.
Thanks for watching. You can download the Roil app at your app store by searching for Roil Technology or Roil Mobile, or you can sign up at roil.com. We'll see you there.